Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our MHRC seminar this afternoon, featuring Dr. Rachel Colley from Statistics Canada. So we're in for a treat today because, instead of the usual molecular stuff that we're talking about, we're going to get some real insight on the health patterns of Canadians, the activity patterns of Canadians, trends and challenges and future directions. So Rachel is from the Ottawa area. Originally, she lived in Nepean and went to undergraduate university at Queen's University in Kingston. She then went to do her PhD in Australia at Queensland University of Technology. She fast-tracked from the master's into the PhD program. She came back to Ottawa and worked as a postdoc with Mark Tremblay at the Children's Hospital of Central Ontario, and then began working at Statistics Canada in Tunney's pasture in Ottawa, where Health Canada has its main offices. She's been there since 2016. So again, I'm very pleased to have Rachel join us today. Again, the title, Physical Activity Among Canadians, Trends, Challenges, and Future Directions. Dr. Colley, if you wouldn't mind sharing your screen with us and your microphone on, and we'll take it away.
Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes, we're good.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, and hello everyone. It's really nice to be here, and I'd like to thank David and Jen Cook for the invitation and putting this together. There's already been a bit of background given about me, but I'll just say my current position is a senior research analyst at Statistics Canada, and I have been in this role since 2016, but prior to that I did consult starting in 2007 at Statistics Canada, working with the team on the Canadian Health Measures Survey. So as David mentioned, this is going to be a bit of a change, I understand, from what you typically have in your Friday afternoon seminar series. So hopefully it's something interesting and will give you food for thought as you go into the weekend. So what I'm going to cover is a bit of background about one of our large health surveys that I think will be of interest to this group. I'll talk a little bit about how we measure physical activity, and then just kind of give you a potpourri overview of some of the findings that we've had from this data set over the last decade or so. And then I'm going to talk about everyone's favorite topic, COVID-19, and how that has impacted physical activity in Canada. And I'm going to finish by kind of talking a little bit about where we're trying to go in the future and the ways that we're thinking about things in a hopefully soon to be a post-COVID world. And then I'll also give some information just about different ways that you might want to engage with Statistics Canada data in your own work. So if you've never heard of the Canadian Health Measures Survey, it's a large national survey that started in 2007. We get about 5,000 to 6,000 people in this survey per cycle, and it takes us 2 years to collect all that data. So what's really different about this survey for StatsCan is that we're not just conducting a survey over the phone. We're actually driving in tractor trailers across the country and setting up camp at different sites across the country for weeks at a time and recruiting people through a random sampling procedure into this clinic and collecting direct measures. So the best example I can give you is, instead of just asking people if they have high blood pressure or if they're taking blood pressure medication, we do that, but then we also measure their blood pressure in a controlled laboratory environment. So there's sort of 3 distinct phases to the Canadian Health Measures Survey. We start with a questionnaire face-to-face in a person's house. They're then invited to come to this mobile examination center for about 2 to 2.5 hours. And here we're taking blood samples, urine samples, hair samples. We're measuring blood pressure, fitness, vision, bone density, all kinds of things. And then all of those samples are sent off to different labs across the country. Some of those samples are processed right away, and we produce data sets with blood markers. And then some of those samples are stored for future use. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the next few slides, but just really want to give you a sense of the breadth of all of the topics that are covered in this survey and how some of them have been there since the beginning and are always there. Like smoking, for example, or anthropometry, height and weight, we always do those things, but then other sampling procedures such as indoor air samples or tap water samples are done certain cycles and not others. So that's what's done in the household, this questionnaire and a few samples. When people come to the clinic, you can see some pictures on this slide of what the clinic actually looks like. So it's a real working clinic. They're able to process blood samples right there on site. And again, here you see some measures come and go, whether it's hearing, vision, fitness, all kinds of different measures. So really a lot of options and a lot of breadth in this survey. So from there, all of these samples go to different labs, as I mentioned, and David and I were just chatting before the presentation about the biobank, which might be of interest to some of you here, that there's all of these at the very bottom of this slide, you can see serum, plasma, whole blood, urine, and DNA samples that are stored for future use, and Canadian researchers can apply to get access to those samples for their own research. So this slide is just showing you pictures of kind of what it's like to be in the mobile examination center and all the fun things that we make people do while they're there. So what I'm going to talk about a lot today is the physical activity portion of this survey. And so we measure physical activity using the Accelerometer, which is this small device that people wear on a belt around their waist. So they're given this at that mobile examination center visit. And they're fitted with it and everything and sent home with instructions to wear it for 7 days following that clinic visit. So from those data we get, it's blinded to the participants, so they don't see anything. But when those devices get mailed back to StatsCan, we download them, we apply these intensity thresholds, and then we can divide that person's day into how much time they spent being sedentary, lightly active, moderately active, and vigorously active. So up until the end of cycle 6 in 2019, we were only asking people to wear the devices during the day. So when they woke up until they went to bed. In the future, we're going to switch to a 24-hour protocol, which will allow us to get an objective measure of sleep quantity and hopefully some idea of quality as well. So why do we use accelerometers and questionnaires? Well, they're very different, in fact, and we spent a lot of time, probably more about a decade ago, trying to make these match, and they really don't. And I think more recently, we've all accepted that maybe they don't need to match, and that's okay, as long as we understand kind of how they're similar and how they're different. So they're similar in the sense that they're both measuring physical activity, but on a questionnaire, you're really telling us about your perception of time that you can recall that you spent in recreational physical activity, actively transporting, or being active in your job or at home. So obviously we're dealing with limitations of recall and bias. We all want to sound more active than we are. Whereas an accelerometer is measuring actual motion, and we're dividing that into different intensities. But we have limitations there too. It doesn't measure cycling, swimming, and we also don't know where and how people were active. So if we want to take action from a public health perspective, we don't really know if people are really active in their transportation or if they're really active in sports and at the gym. So to just kind of give you a real world example of how difficult this is, if you played hockey for 60 minutes, you would for sure report that as 60 minutes of activity on a questionnaire. But on your accelerometer worn for that 60 minutes, you would at best get about 15 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So there's two reasons there. It's just the sporadic nature of hockey being a stop and start type of sport, but also the accelerometer is averaging counts over periods of a minute. So it's actually quite hard to get above that moderate threshold sometimes when you're doing a stop-start activity. So what is the correlation between our questionnaire data and our accelerometer data? Well, that's not great. So we know that, and we spend a lot of time thinking about this and trying to reconcile what it means. And the reason why this is important is because we have other surveys at Statistics Canada that are much larger sample size that are only questionnaire based. So what the CHMS does is it gives us the opportunity to have that kind of, it's not necessarily a gold standard, but just a comparison method to sort of see how our questionnaire is working. And when we change questions, we can see sort of how that lines up better or worse with the accelerometer. So we're looking at a Pearson correlation of 0.3, not very good. You can see that recreation and transportation are more highly correlated with the accelerometer data. And that occupational household one is not correlated at all. And in fact, is more correlated with light intensity physical activity. So what does this mean when we start to look at relationships with health? In general, sort of the take-home message from these investigations, and this is just an example here using change in body mass index and waist circumference for every additional 30 minutes of exercise. The top 3 sort of clusters of bars are showing accelerometer measured data. So you can see a larger effect size, but still going associated in the negative direction for measures of obesity. The self-reported data on the bottom half is showing the same direction, but just not the same magnitude. And so this is where you get into that, reported versus measured data. Sometimes you may get more precision with your measured data. And if your research question is really about understanding an association, then your accelerometer measured data might be the way to go. But if you're wanting to look at kind of broader, population perspective, or if you want to be able to say something about a small geographic area in Canada, then you're probably going to have to go with a questionnaire-based approach. So the future of accelerometer measurement in the CHMS is that it's going to stay, which is great, but we're actually transitioning to a new device. So we're going to be switching to the Actigraph device for several reasons, but largely this is in line with a lot of other large-scale surveys. The company that owns and runs Actical is not supporting the device anymore. And the Actigraph offers some flexibility to be worn on the waist, but also on the wrist. We're not quite ready to transition to wrist-worn accelerometry yet. But that's something that we're working towards in the future. So if you were seeing the photos of what it looks like to be in the mobile examination center for the CHMS, you can understand that COVID is causing some problems for this survey. So it has been on hold for the last year and a half, and we hope to get back into the field next year. And as I mentioned, we'll be switching to a 24-hour protocol. So physical activity is great, we know that, but what about the other 23 and a half hours a day? Does it matter what we do in that period of time? And so this is assuming someone is doing exercise for 30 minutes a day. This is something that's really changed, I'd say, in the last 5 years. There's been a shift away from just talking about exercise and physical activity to acknowledging that, it probably matters what else happens in the day. So if you have two people who both exercise for 30 minutes, if one of them sits at their desk all day for the other waking hours, where compared to somebody else who might be, a teacher or a nurse or somebody who is actually on their feet moving around, not necessarily vigorously, but in a sort of a light intensity, the health profile of those two people is probably quite different. And also with you're sleeping a lot, if your quality of your sleep is good or worse than somebody else, that's going to affect your energy level and your ability to engage in physical activity throughout the day. So we've transitioned now to 24-hour movement guidelines. So the physical activity recommendation is now housed within kind of a package of guidelines along with sedentary behavior recommendations and sleep recommendations. So there's kind of a busy slide here, but just to kind of summarize what it is in Canada for the different age groups. So we have different guidelines for preschoolers, children and youth are lumped together, and then adults and older adults are typically lumped together. So physical activity for very young children, it's 180 minutes per day, any intensity, so just any type of movement. Whereas children and youth, it needs to be an hour a day, moderate to vigorous. And then adults, it's 150 minutes per week or 20 minutes per day, thereabouts. And then you can see the screen time recommendation, and this is just leisure time. So don't worry if you're not getting 3 hours or less per day. If you're an academic, I'm sure it's a lot more. So your work screen time doesn't count here. We're interested in the leisure time, physical activity outside of work. And then the sleep recommendations along the bottom. So where are we? How are we doing? We're doing quite well with preschoolers. So 3/4 meeting the target. Children and youth, only 1/3. And then about half of adults meet the physical activity recommendation. So these numbers are based on the accelerometer measured data from the CHMS. And if you were to look at the questionnaire data, you'd get a similar story. Numbers would be a little bit higher, but similar story. So we are getting better over time at sort of calibrating our questionnaire to align a little bit better with the accelerometer data. At the individual level, it doesn't line up very well, but at the population level, it's not that bad. How sedentary are Canadians? Well, it depends on the age group, but quite sedentary. So this recreational screen time is something that we're very concerned about, especially in young children and especially in youth. And the new 24-hour guidelines actually they just came out in 2020. They do have a guideline now for adults, which wasn't there before, which is 3 hours or less per day. So I don't have any data for that one yet, but we do have some. I am aware of a paper in the pipeline is coming out that will give that type of information. So the problem with screen time guidelines is that we don't really capture the breadth of what is sedentary behavior. So how much are people sitting, doing other stuff? And what about passive commuting? Passive commuting probably has gone down a bit with teleworking, but everything is sort of shifting back now in society. So that's something that's went down, but could go back up. Are Canadians sleeping enough? This one we're doing pretty well, according to, this is all self-reported data. So when we get the accelerometer up and running for 24-hour wear protocols, we might get a different story. But certainly the gap that we have is on quality. So even though the quantity looks pretty good, we do have a lot of adults reporting that they don't have very good quality sleep. So has physical activity changed over the past decade? So we've had this nice accelerometer measure since 2007 that has not changed, which is great. So it's allowed us to kind of track the trends in physical activity across the lifespan. And so you can see some little differences here, but no significant shifts up or down in physical activity. Now, at the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of COVID-19, because that has had an impact on the physical activity levels of Canadians. So you have to stay tuned for that one. So now I'm just going to shift to running through some different results pretty quickly and high level. Could try to fit in as many concepts as possible, but just to show you kind of what we've done with the accelerometer data to date. So we've looked at when Canadians are accumulating physical activity, and this is a chance for me to plug the per minute file, which is the raw data file from the accelerometers. So if you really like data and you want to get right into the data yourself and you don't trust the way that we've derived minutes of moderate physical activity, you can actually access in the research data centers across Canada the raw per minute data. And so we did this as quite a long time ago now, but looked at just on the x-axis of these figures, you can see the time from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. And what you can see with the different colors of lines is that young children are the most active across the whole day. They have distinct peaks kind of around lunchtime and maybe after school, and it goes down from there. Adults are pretty stable and low across the day. And then the graph on the right is just showing the weekend difference for the whole population. So with our weekdays appearing to be more active. And again, those peaks kind of happening at midday and sort of around the dinner hour. So some other questions: does it matter when physical activity is accumulated? And this question is important because the adult physical activity guideline is a per week target. So 150 minutes per week basically implies, doesn't matter when you do it. If you cram it all in on Saturday, fine. So there's been some research to look at that to sort of confirm, is that actually the case? Because you could think about things like, muscle contractions and glucose control, that maybe a little bit every day would be a better approach. So there are a series of papers out here, and this is just one by Janine Clark and Ian Jansen, where they looked at the frequency of physical activity participation and found that it didn't really matter how you accumulated it, as long as you accumulated it. So I would say the take-home message is just to encourage people to figure out a way that works for them, just to get the activity in one way or the other. Now, does it matter how physical activity is accumulated? And so this one is also kind of a not really. So the old guideline was 150 minutes per week, but it had to be accumulated in bouts of 10 minutes or more. And that has changed. So it's still 150 minutes per week, but now all minutes count. And so this paper by Janine also and Ian Jansen was an important one that fed into the decision to drop that bout requirement, both in the US and then in Canada, just showing that that was too strict kind of a definition. And it actually led to a communication challenge for us from a surveillance point of view, because with the old guideline being more strict, only 15% of Canadian adults were meeting the guideline. And overnight, we seemingly went to 45%. But it was just that change in how we were analyzing the data. So we can't possibly be on our feet and moving around all day, but how much is too much sedentary time? And this one is really, we don't really know. And the average sedentary time in Canada for adults is 9.5 hours, about 8.5 hours for kids. So it seems like a lot, but a lot of these things, we sit to eat, we have to sit to work, there's a lot of things that are just kind of normal and I would say expected sedentary behavior. So how do we figure out a way to measure how much is too much? And so the new guidelines are starting to try to put some, lines in the sand, so to speak. And so the adult guidelines have a target, floating around the 8 to 9 hour of total sedentary time, and then screen time, 3 hours or less for adults, 2 hours or less for kids. The other way of looking at sedentary time, and some researchers have done this, especially Valerie Carson, who's a researcher at the University of Alberta, has looked at kind of does it matter the patterns of sedentary time? So we all have some blips of sedentary time throughout our day, but does it matter if we have these long stretches where we're just sitting idle for hours at a time? And so they did find in adults anyway, that those breaking up your long bouts of sedentary time was associated in a good way with markers like waist circumference, triglycerides, glucose, insulin. She repeated the same study in children, but didn't find any association. And this doesn't necessarily mean there isn't one there. One of the challenges we have in a large population health survey is that you have a relatively, healthy population, especially in your children and youth. But the figure here just shows kind of the complexity of the coding that she was having to do to sort of identify and make decision rules about picking up the patterns of what is a sedentary bout and what counts as a break in sedentary bouting. So if I were to increase my physical activity, does it matter where I take the time from? Not really. We did this study a couple of years ago using a technique called Isotemporal Substitution, which essentially just allows you to sort of look at what happens when you shift time from sedentary sleep or light physical activity towards moderate to vigorous physical activity. And along the x-axis here, we're looking again at change in body mass index and waist circumference. And then any transfer to MBPA are these long bars, so showing that that's the most impact. But shifting anything, between sedentary and sleep or to light physical activity didn't seem to have any effect for this particular health outcome. We also looked at this for self-reported general health and mental health, and found some similar findings there. But interestingly, when we sort of dug a little bit deeper into the data, we looked at this just in older Canadians compared to younger Canadians, so 50 plus and younger than 50. And then we looked at overweight and obese Canadians versus those who are a healthy weight. And we started to see that sedentary to light transfer of time was beneficial in those populations. And so herein lies kind of one of the challenges. We have these intensity thresholds that we apply to everybody in the sample, but they don't necessarily work for everyone. So if you can imagine, your gait gets less efficient as you get older and as your body size is larger. So you don't have to be as active to burn the same amount of energy. So we're not really accounting for that because we don't have individualized cut points for these different populations. We kind of are taking this one size fits all, and that's one of the realities of, sort of population-based analysis. But it was just interesting to see that this started to play out in the results. And I think in general, the attention on light physical activity is starting to gain a bit more attention. And even the new guidelines have wording and recommendations around, physical activity is great, but even messages about just move more, sit less. So really trying to bring people out of that highly sedentary habits and into some kind of movement to hopefully capture kind of a wider base of population. So another area that we've looked at is attaching environmental measures to our health surveys. So one example is neighborhood walkability associated with physical activity across the lifespan? And the answer is depends on your age. So if you don't know what I'm talking about with walkability, I've put in a little reminder to myself to just explain what is walkability. So this is essentially a measure of how friendly your neighborhood design is to support physical activity. It was developed by researchers at McGill under the lead of Nancy Ross. It's comprised of population density amenities, like are there things to walk to, and then the connectivity of sidewalks and streets. So you have class 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Class 5 being the most walkable, think of your urban downtown areas, and class 1 being your rural areas. Most Canadians actually live in the sort of a class 2, 3 type of neighborhood. So when we looked at this, so the bars, each cluster of bars is representing kind of like the walkability from 1 to 5. So the blue, light blue being the most walkable type of neighborhood and the black being the least. And then you have your different age groups along the bottom. So the big black arrows are just denoting that the trend was only significant for an increase in physical activity across the walkability categories for adults between the ages of 18 and 59. So not really having an effect in children and not in older adults. So when we looked at our self-reported questionnaire data, which is important, and this we could specifically target active transportation, which is the type of physical activity most likely associated with neighborhood walkability, you could see a very strong kind of increase across the categories from youth right up through all ages of adults. But with children, and this is back to the CHMS, so this is parent-reported data on unorganized physical activity or active free play. You can see it actually decreases as you get into more walkable neighborhoods. And this is pretty consistent with the literature. Like before we did this study, there was Canadian research looking at walkability and physical activity in adults and children. And for adults, it was pretty consistently a positive story, positive relationship. But in children, it was a bit more mixed, and it wasn't always showing that walkability was good for kids. And if you think about it, if you look at these two pictures on the left, you have kind of a busy urban area. You can imagine yourself as an adult, you would walk or bike in this area and be able to navigate the risks and challenges that are there. But for a child, they're looking for something on the right, which is wide open spaces that are nice and green and that are safe. So the conclusion of this work and a lot of others has really been that walkability is a relevant concept for adults and certainly for active transportation. But for children, I think if we're looking for built environment supports for physical activity, it's really different issues. Are there parks nearby? Is it safe? So I'm going to just spend a slide or two talking about another kind of cool sub-sample of the Canadian Health Measures Survey, which is our parent-child dyad file. So if we think back to the first couple of slides I was talking about, we have in the CHMS this household interview followed by this mobile examination center. Well, you can imagine if you had a 3 to 11-year-old child, somebody is going to bring that child to the mobile examination center, and they're going to have to sit there and wait for their child to undergo all of the tests. So we started back in cycle 1, making sure that we also sampled that adult who accompanied the child to the mobile examination center to be a participant in the CHMS. And this created a really unique dyad. We call it the dyad data file. So just a paired data file. Now, the person who brings the child to the mobile examination center isn't always a biological parent, but that is most typically who it is. So, but we know the relationship, and that's on the file. So we have siblings and grandparents and different caregiver relationships. But by and large, the only relationship that we have enough of to do anything with analytically is the biological parent. And so this data set is now available to Canadian researchers as well through the research data centers. And we've done a little bit of work with this data set over the years to show that there's a correlation between preschoolers and their parents in physical activity. Same is true for older children and youth. Fit kids tend to have fit parents. So this is looking at measures of fitness from the CHMS. So grip strength, aerobic fitness through a step test, and a sit and reach flexibility test. And this was especially strong in mothers and sons. Parent screen time is correlated with that of their kids, but especially their daughters. And children with an obese parent are more likely to be overweight or obese. So I'm just going to check my time. Okay, so for COVID-19, this caused obviously a huge disruption to all of our lives, but it did cause a disruption to our typical data collection vehicles at Statistics Canada, including the CCHS and the CHMS. So the CCHS, just to refresh, is this kind of larger scale. We get 65,000 people per year in the CCHS, but it's just an interview over the phone, just a health questionnaire. The CHMS is the questionnaire plus all of those lab measures. So much smaller, but sort of direct measures, robust measures in that one. So the priorities shifted early in the pandemic towards the census and the labor force survey. We had some sort of adaptation on the fly to do some crowdsourcing surveys, and we had a small survey called the Canadian Perspective Survey Series. And it was really just a time, I think everyone was trying to grapple with how are Canadians doing, how are Canadians responding to the pandemic. And so there was a few mechanisms in place to try to get a little bit of information. So I'll talk a little bit about what we knew kind of early on in the pandemic. And then now that some of the larger scale surveys are back in the field, we're getting better data coming in. So just to take us back to March 12th, 2020, you might have been doing something ridiculous and irresponsible like this. The next day, we were all kind of doing this, and it dramatically changed our lives in a very short period of time. In the weeks that followed, we were getting all kinds of messages coming, go home and stay home, don't leave your house, but also you should exercise. I think it's good for your mental health because this is really stressful and scary. Messages were coming from the World Health Organization, American College of Sports Medicine, Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology, you name it. Everyone was telling you to exercise, but to stay home. So it was a tricky time. Many people were shifting their daily routines. They were homeschooling their kids. They were trying to work at the same time. They were trying to not leave their house. So, I don't need to tell you this story. We've all lived through this reality. But what it meant for physical activity is that it really made it different and hard to exercise. And I put these pictures on this slide purposely because all of a sudden it became really important where you lived in terms of your opportunities for outdoor recreation. So if you lived in a busy downtown urban area, it was hard to go outside and exercise within a certain proximity to your house without running into a lot of people. Whereas if you lived in suburbia or even out in the country, you had greater opportunities for outdoor exercise. So one of the first things that we were really interested in getting a handle on in Canada was how are Canadians doing in terms of their mental health. So the early reports showing a comparison between 2018, so pre-pandemic, to during pandemic is the light blue, and mental health. So this is the percentage reporting that they have very good or excellent mental health. So a huge drop overall across the board, but you can see that it was younger Canadians who were suffering more with their mental health. Once we got up to these higher age groups, they were faring quite well. In terms of exercise and screen time, we didn't ask the same questions that we ask in our other large health surveys. Unfortunately, we asked some very sort of quick on the fly questions about just whether people were doing any sort of indoor or outdoor exercise. So you can see here about 2/3 of adults were reporting that they were exercising early on in the pandemic. And this is the timestamp, I should say, is sort of the end of March, beginning of April, 2020. So older men reported more outdoor exercise than younger men, and women were more likely to report doing indoor exercise. In terms of screen time, not surprisingly, older participants were less likely to report increases in screen use, and women reported more increased internet use, especially in that middle age range of 35 to 54. And men were more likely to report increased video game use. So we didn't have any information about how much people were exercising or watching TV. All we knew was whether they were doing any exercise, yes or no, and then whether they had changed their screen behavior. What we were able to see, though, is that for women in particular, those who were exercising outdoors were more likely to report very good or excellent mental health. This was not true for men. Men were fairly consistently reporting their mental health. And this is somewhat consistent with the literature. There's not a ton of literature here, but just the link between exercise and kind of control of depressive symptoms, there is a bit of a gender difference there and stronger in women. So then in September 2020, we were managed to get the Canadian Community Health Survey back in the field. So this is just the questionnaire one again. And so there was this September to December data file available to us. And this allowed us to start making some comparisons with our kind of big data sets, comparing back to pre-pandemic times with a consistent data collection mechanism. So just a reminder here about CCHS, larger sample size, unlike the CHMS, which I was talking about with the accelerometers and blood samples, which is only representative at the national level, the CCHS, we can go down to provincial and even health region level. So this paper came out about a month ago. Jenny Watt and myself, just a very quick, trying to get some high level overview of what's happening with physical activity in Canada pre-pandemic to during pandemic. So we compared the fall period of 2020 to the fall period of 2018. As you know, there's a strong seasonality effect on physical activity. So we wanted to make sure we pulled those same time periods or season periods out. So what you can see here is really that youth were the ones who dropped significantly with their physical activity. Adults were almost bang on exactly the same. Older adults actually showing a bit of an increase in their physical activity. So when you look at youth and you think about what was happening in the fall of 2020, there were school closures, kids were in and out of school, most sports and organized activities were canceled or reduced. So without those typical sources of physical activity, youth were definitely reporting less physical activity through recreation and at school. Now for adults, and this is just sort of speculation, we're more likely to probably be going for walks and setting up home gyms And this may explain in part why they were able to maintain their physical activity levels. And in some cases, if you look at younger adults, able to increase their physical activity a little bit, and older adults around the home able to increase a little bit, and active transportation, walking to and from places, was increased a little bit. So these are average daily minutes of physical activity per day. So when you sort of think of this on a per week basis, this is quite a bit of a change in physical activity. And just interestingly, we pulled in our retail sales division at StatsCan to give us some stats on how much money Canadians were spending on home exercise equipment. And there was a huge increase in the fall of 2020 compared to the fall of 2018. So that sort of is corroborating this speculation story that I'm giving you. So the follow-up analysis that I'm working on right now and hoping to submit 3 days ago is really, we know that COVID-19, the virus, has disproportionately impacted Canadians from specific population groups. But at the broad population level, it appears as though physical activity remains stable among adults. But the question now is this true for all Canadians? So the same way that there was a disproportionate impact for specific population groups, was that the same for physical activity? And arguably physical activity is a key strategy to kind of mitigate the stresses of the pandemic. And so what we're doing right now is looking at a finer age breakdown. So you can sort of get into that, younger adult, middle-aged adult, older adults, looking at by sex, by geography across the country, immigration status, Indigenous identity, race, ethnicity, as far down as we can go. Income, education, family structure, job type. There's all kinds of a wealth of information on the Canadian Community Health Survey that we're going to pull into this analysis. And this fits with just sort of this equity approach to COVID-19 from the Chief Public Health Officer's report from late 2020. So that's kind of where I'm working right now. Beyond this, and where we're heading next in general, kind of in health research at StatsCan, is we're thinking about the enduring impacts of COVID-19 on the health of Canadians. And we have this disaggregated data action plan. So I'm going to walk you through what I mean by these two big headings. So this is a really busy slide, my apologies. And this is kind of a work in progress, but a framework of how we're thinking about health research at Statistics Canada right now. So kind of walk through from the left here, we had the COVID-19 pandemic that had negative and positive impacts in terms of our work-life balance and our day-to-day routines. And this has led to kind of initial health impacts and changes to health behaviors, including physical activity. There's been changes in family violence risk, substance misuse, feelings of isolation, and this is going to lead to longer term health impacts. There's been an interruption in our healthcare and access to healthcare, health screening, and this is all going to lead to downstream well-being, physical and mental health, and ultimately mortality. Now, at the same time, what we're trying to think about right now is that a lot of the changes that happened because of COVID-19, whether it's teleworking or telemedicine, a lot of these changes are here to stay. And some of these are good and some of these are bad, but it's really going to change the way that we live our lives. And this is going to continue to impact our health. So we're thinking about that. And then the last part to notice on this figure is just these kind of yellow bars all the way around, is these kind of taking an equity lens. So early on in the pandemic, different people were impacted differently. Moving forward, we're going to continue to see that different people are going to be impacted differently by these enduring changes to how our society functions. And that will ultimately lead to differences by those population groups when we look at longer term impacts on health and mortality. So what we're trying to do right now is create these frameworks, and part of the job that I've been involved in for the past couple of months for this particular project is to think about, do we have the data collection mechanisms in place for the next 10 years to make sure that we can answer really good research questions about how these enduring changes are going to impact the health of Canadians moving forward. So this is just something just wanted to put out there of how we're thinking about things, but it's obviously it's an evolving situation as is COVID. So I wanted to also talk about, if you've listened to the presentation and you think there's some data at StatsCan that might be of use to you or that would be of interest to you, there's many ways that you can engage with Statistics Canada and get access to the data yourselves. So the Research Data Center, hopefully you're aware, there is one at York University. Every university across Canada has access to a Research Data Center. So this is a secure data repository where you can access the data holdings of StatsCan. There's a lot of sort of hoops to go through to get yourself set up, but it is well worthwhile to do that if you're interested in any sort of population health research. One other fairly new way to engage with StatsCan data is this Canadian Statistical Geospatial Explorer, which I'll give you a bit more detail in the next few slides. I think I have a minute or two to do that. The other way is to engage with someone like me. So create a collaboration with a Statistics Canada analyst. I think, from my conversation with David, I'll be putting him in touch with the guy who runs our biobank team to see what might be possible and what the process is to engage with those stored samples and maybe use those samples in future work. We have a custom tabulations. So this is more of a cost recovery. If you have a data table that you just really want to produce, or a series of data tables that you need to produce for a table or for a paper, you can request it and pay for it and get exactly what you want. And that is always an option as well. So I kind of float sometimes between a lot of collaborative projects, and I'm sometimes doing custom tabulations for researchers and policymakers. And I just wanted to mention the health reports, which is it's a peer-reviewed health journal at Statistics Canada. A lot of Canadian researchers don't realize that they can submit papers to health reports, but you definitely can. The scope for health reports is it's just any sort of population-based data source. So it doesn't have to be representative of Canada as a whole, but has to be representative of some population within Canada. And so I can certainly answer questions more specifically about what might be appropriate or not. It's usually Statistics Canada data holdings, but not always. Sometimes we publish other population-based, say like an Ontario database survey. And it has a high impact factor, and it's free to submit, and also it's open access, which is important. So just very quickly, I want to allow a bit of time for questions. This is the Canadian Statistical Geospatial Explorer Hub. So if you can just Google this and you can go straight to this tool, and it's actually really cool. And I don't know if you can see, it's quite small here, but you can choose from all these drop-down menus on the left-hand side: health, census, income, whatever topic you're interested in. You can pick the year, you can pick the age group and sex, you can zoom in on a geographic area of Canada, and we'll actually give you the data for that area. And you can even spit it out as an Excel spreadsheet. And in some cases, this will be more than enough data for you to work with in your analysis. Now, if you want something that's sort of more detailed or down to a lower geographic area than dissemination area, then you would want to explore getting access through the Research Data Center. But this is a cool tool just for a lot of policymakers and people working in municipal planning are using this tool all of the time. And we're continually adding data to this repository. So we right now have 2016 census data in there. There's data from the Canadian Community Health Survey, the index of deprivation, remoteness. We're working on getting walkability in there, crime data, low income data. There's a food environment data set that is about to be released to the research data centers, and it's going to end up in this tool as well. So just something to keep your eye on if you just want to kind of explore Statistics Canada data. This is a really good place to start. And I'm going to stop there, and thank you very much for your attention, and happy to take questions today, but happy to receive questions by email if you think of something in the future or you want to be connected with somebody on a specific topic at StatsCan. So thank you.
Wow, that's fantastic. What a great story, and so many great bits of information. I couldn't stop writing while I was listening to you. That's fantastic. So we're open for questions, of course, for Rachel through the Q&A tab. And if you want to, just type it in and I will read the question out, and Rachel can field those questions. So while we're waiting for that just to show up, I was fascinated by the activity levels of Canadians not changing over the last roughly 10 years, I think you said, in each age group and each, boys versus girls, men versus women. I thought perhaps our activity levels have actually gone down over the last decade, but apparently not. And that's my first surprise. And then the second surprise is the boy versus girl difference that I never really suspected. Boys being more active than girls. So are you surprised by that lack of change over the last decade? I would have thought that people would become less active, but obviously not.
Yeah. And the trouble is that we don't have, accelerometer measured data prior to 2007. And so it would be nice to be able to go further back. But when we look back at sort of what happened with the fitness levels of Canadians between, say, the 1980s and the early 2000s, that's where there's been a bit more of a decrease. So there's a couple of papers out there, some from Cor Craig and Mark Tremblay. Grant Tompkinson is a researcher who does a lot of international kind of fitness comparisons. So fitness is kind of giving us, it's not physical activity, the behavior, but kind of the sort of state of someone's ability to do physical activity. It looks like it decreased a lot from the 1980s to the early 2000s, but since the early 2000s to now has remained relatively stable. So we've kind of watched, and I didn't have time to fit it in today, but we do have these fitness measures in the CHMS as well, and they have also remained stable, like physical activity, and same as obesity has remained relatively stable across time. So I wouldn't say I'm surprised by that they're all kind of telling a bit of the same story. And we didn't have these great measures early on, but from the data sources that we do have, from the 80s, 90s, seems to show that that's maybe where there was the drop, and now there's the stability. And so you could say that's a good news story that we've been stable, but it's still low. So that's often the conclusion of our papers, is that, while this is stable and it's not decreasing, we still have, only a third of kids who are meeting the guideline of where they should be. And you're absolutely right. And, I didn't talk about it a lot in the presentation, but the difference between boys and girls is really wide. And it's especially true in that youth age group. So young children, boys and girls stay relatively similar. And then we lose girls sort of in those teenage years, and that's a real problem. So when we sort of see these overall averages of, on average, kids get 60 minutes of physical activity per day, or 59 minutes. That's, boys are getting 80 and girls are getting, 30 or 40. There's this big divide there. And it's the same thing with the COVID-19 story. I didn't present any of the results of sort of digging deeper, but I can say, it looks stable when you throw adults all in there together. But when you start breaking down by, geography and immigrant status and race and ethnicity, it is not the same across the board. So it is really important that we have that richness of data on these special population groups, because it depends who you are and where you live will predict your physical activity a lot.
Yeah, I mean, the follow-up that you just hit on is really the ethnic differences, cultural differences, that sort of thing. Your data would allow analysis of that, I guess, with it. I mean, you can really tell the difference, cultural differences and stuff like that.
Yeah, so the key thing that we have, and we're talking about this a lot now, is we have race and ethnicity, about 14 different categories. We often lack the sample size to break it down and present numbers for each one of those. And so, but there's a lot of pressure right now to do as best as we can. And so we're getting better. We're trying to merge cycles together. We're trying to oversample certain populations to be able to get to that point. But that's a really, really important piece of the story. And the other thing that's key is that race and ethnicity on its own, it tells only part of the story, because new immigrants to Canada, there's sort of this healthy immigrant effect. So they come to Canada, they can be quite healthy. The longer they live in Canada, they tend to get less healthy. So it's really important to, I know it's not good, but it's good to look at ethnicity, but also we have variables on the file that show us time since immigration to Canada. So we know if they were born in Canada and they're a certain ethnicity, or we know that they immigrated 10 years ago or 1 year ago. And that's an important piece to the story too, when you're looking at health.
Right. There was one bit of information on that you presented. I think it was maybe Mark Tremblay's study about 150 minutes a week. And you were talking about, does it matter when you get this physical activity during the week and how well you break it up? And you I think concluded that it didn't really matter. But then later there's a study on that, maybe it was an Australian study or something, I can't remember where, but talked about breaking it up was good for you. Like breaking up is good for you. So, into smaller aliquots of time is better for glucose metabolism or something. Can you explain this to me? I mean, I need a better understanding of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not an easy answer. I would say they did several large systematic reviews and looked at hundreds of papers on these topics when they were trying to decide whether you needed to have bouted physical activity or not. So the evidence at the time, back in sort of 2008, 2009, when they were revising those guidelines, seemed to point to, we needed to have these sort of more concrete chunks of physical activity for it to actually be, if we were counting every single minute that people were doing sporadically throughout the day, it probably wasn't moderate to vigorous. And so that was their sort of thinking at the time, and the body of evidence, nobody was really researching it. And so then, of course, when those guidelines came out with that bout requirement, it led to a lot of people asking the question, like, does that really matter? And do we want to discard all of this data? When I have a minute of moderate to vigorous physical activity here or there, are we really going to discard it? So that's looking at it from the physical activity lens, and that's a whole body of research. The other research, about breaking up, that was on the sedentary time side. So that's kind of, we're still talking about activity and movement, but it's kind of the other end of the spectrum. So when we sit, instead of just sitting all day, if these messages you hear sometimes, like every half hour, stand up and walk around your office or your desk or your house or wherever you are, that's sort of coming from a different body of research. Looking at sedentary time. And so total sedentary time doesn't seem to matter. But when you start to dig a bit deeper and you're looking at patterns of sedentary time, it's the people who are sitting for long stretches and never getting up. So obviously it's related to physical activity, like they're one and the same, but it's kind of like we've had these two camps, people working on the physical activity side and the sedentary behavior side. And then, what you're doing is trying to bring them together, which is great. And that's what the 24-hour guidelines it does a good job of kind of telling the story. Maybe we need to start thinking about these things in combination and not sort of isolation, because as soon as you decrease your sedentary time, hopefully you're getting more activity or more sleep. And, does it matter how we shift things around in the day? So.
Yeah. It'd be good to get that straightened out. Here's a question, anonymous attendee. Do we have data related to community engagement and physical activity? I'm thinking about my level of activity when I lived in residence beside my friends, and now that most are about an hour of transit away from me. So people moving away from their home communities, and how that migration impacts likelihood of engaging in physical activity.
Yeah, that's a good question. In these large health surveys, we don't have, like, every question takes time, and we battle tooth and nail to try to fit in the questions that we want on physical activity. We do have questions that relate to this a little bit with children and youth. I would point probably to a survey I didn't talk about today, which is the Canadian Health Survey on Children and Youth, which is collected just in young children up to the age of 12. And they have a lot more questions like this. They ask questions about, do you have friends who are active? Do you have friends who support you to be active? Do you have friends who play sports? Those kind of questions. So I would say, yes, we have some questionnaire content about that, but I would say it's more for children and youth. But it's a good point, like a point well taken, that these sort of community supports, we don't have questions like that for adults. Sometimes I'm thinking of one, the Canadian Community Health Survey, the one that is just questionnaire. We have something called the rapid response modules, where we can get a questionnaire into the field really fast on a focused topic. And we did do one on sort of neighborhood barriers to physical activity. So it's not exactly what you're asking about with, peers and community, but it was asking about kind of, do you feel like your neighborhood is safe? Do you talk to people on your street? Do you feel comfortable going out at night? Those kinds of things. So there are opportunities to kind of take a focus topic and get it into the surveys, but getting into the core CHMS and the core CCHS, I have a hard enough time just fighting to get physical activity questions to stay in there and to be asked consistently. But I love the way you're thinking. This is the rest of the story that we wish we could get.
Yeah, I think related to that is the walkability issue that you spoke about. And it didn't surprise me too much that walkability was important for physical activity levels for people 18 to 59, but for kids, it seems like parkability would be the
Yeah.
appropriate, you know, how much green space, how many parks there are around. And is there any kind of index other than walkability that takes into account maybe the other side of things, like the amount of green space or park space that's available? Does anybody
Yeah.
ever come up with that? Or
Yeah, we're working on it actually.
Okay.
Stephanie Prince is a researcher who years ago did her PhD in Ottawa with Mark, and she was trying to create a playability index. So parkability was a good one too, but she was talking about playability, and that was just an Ottawa-based study that she did for a PhD, and that was kind of going in that direction. We do have greenness data that is satellite measured by NASA. And this is just kind of giving you on a scale of 0 to 1, how green is an area. Now that doesn't tell you too much because, you know, I live beside a private golf course that is private property and I can't go on it. So I would get a super high greenness score, but it's sort of false because it's not a nice, you know, park that I can go and use for physical activity. And then you also, you don't have that context. So there are starting to be more kind of green space databases out there, which are actually identifying parks and usable park spaces and trails. We have some new StatsCan data sources where we've done kind of open source data, pulled it all together to identify parks and recreation facilities, community centers. And there's a database if anyone's interested in it, I can send you the link to it. It's available for download right off the web. So that's kind of cool. So we're starting to sort of look at those more environmental supports for physical activity because we don't, as you said, you know, we can't seem to nudge this behavior in the Canadian population. It's very stable. And so researchers are starting to think like, geez, what else can we do? You know, maybe if we change the environment and make it more conducive to physical activity, then people will accidentally, subconsciously become more active. This is kind of the ambitious goal. But it doesn't work for everyone. And what's interesting about the age thing with kids, it seems that the things that are important for really young kids, you know, like safety and green space and parks are also really important for older adults. So you can imagine once you're retired and you're wanting to walk around in your neighborhood, you're not necessarily like trying to get to the transit system or trying to get to the post office or get to the grocery store where that sort of walkability index makes sense. You know, just the quality of sidewalks, in fact, is really, really important. And, you know, the shade cover from the tree canopy is really, really important. So this is kind of an evolving, emerging area of research. So we're starting to see more of these kind of environmental data sets, which is awesome because if we can get them at a fairly low level of geography, all of the health surveys at StatsCan have a geography identifier on it. Sometimes postal code, sometimes something slightly higher, kind of a neighborhood level. And you can attach those data sets together and ask some really cool research questions.
Yeah, actually, all of this data is awesome. I find this really fascinating. One more question from me. I see one more Q&A come up. Maybe we'll go there. Christina is asking, for the parent-child dyad, do you have a rationale as to why active parents tend to have active children and obese parents have obese children? Is it genetics or lifestyle playing a bigger role? Are active parents more likely to put their children in sports?
Yeah, this is definitely a loaded question. And actually the obesity paper that was led by someone called Tracy Bushneck, I was a co-author on the paper. The reviewers were very harsh on that paper because they brought up this, you know, how can you comment about this if you don't know kind of the genetics behind it? And it was a difficult, it's a difficult story to tell. And the other problem that we have with that dyad file that I didn't tell you about is that we only have one parent. We don't have both biological parents and the child. And it wasn't a random, you know, sample of whether it was the mother or the father. So we more often got the mother. And so there was all kinds of bias issues in the data on top of these issues with sort of nature versus nurture. So we don't really have the data to be able to answer that question just as the data are right now. It's kind of more just descriptively, can we sort of see from an odds ratio, are you more likely to have this if your parent is overweight or obese? And that is all we could do, but there's a limit. Now, in terms of, we did look in the physical activity paper, we looked at whether the kids were signed up for organized activities and sports. And yes, that did play into it as well. So in terms of discussing the results, we spent a lot of time talking about, you know, parental role modeling, which is sort of looking at their physical activity level themselves. but then sort of parental support for physical activity is equally important. So there were sort of independent effects of both of those things. So good if you could do both, but if you could do one or the other, that was also good. So either being active yourself or signing your kids up for sport, those are both positive impacts on the overall level of physical activity for the child. So I don't think I'm answering your question super well, but this is kind of the challenge with these large population health data sets. You have the data that you have and you kind of try to tell a story as best you can, but there are definitely a lot of sort of limitations and things you need to consider.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Well, I guess we're almost out of time. I have just one other short one. Perhaps you indicated that Canadians are getting the same amount of sleep, but the quality of the sleep isn't so good. And I wondered if you had any final insights on why that might be. Are we more stressed now and we're not sleeping as well, or what do you think? What do you think the reason for that is?
Yeah, stress is a big one. I think screen time in the hours before going to bed is another behavior that can really impact your sleep quality. So we actually had a rapid response on sleep habits of Canadians just in early 2020. And I think the paper is done and is coming out, I think, in a few months. And it actually looks at sleep duration, but has kind of sleep hygiene habits. So consistent wake and bedtimes we looked at, and we looked at having an electronic device just in your bedroom. Just yes or no, is there one in there? Not necessarily are you using it. And then are you engaging with a device, an iPad or something in the half hour before you fall asleep? So those are kind of the three key sleep hygiene behaviors that can predict the quality of your sleep. So we've kind of looked at that, and those results are coming out, which will be kind of interesting to look at. All we know so far is that Canadians are typically reporting that they're getting enough sleep in terms of quantity, but they're also very often reporting that the quality of their sleep is not good. We don't really know what that means. They just say the quality is not good, and that they often have trouble falling asleep. So what will be really interesting, and something that I'm sort of consulting on right now with the survey team, we have a whole bunch of pilot data of the 24-hour cycle data, is, can we extract sleep duration from this accelerometer data, but what can we talk about in terms of sleep quality? So, I mean, we have all these devices, Garmin, Fitbit, there's tons of devices out there that can tell us something about our sleep quality. And so we're hopefully going to be able to go down that road with the accelerometer data as well, and derive some variables from that. So that's sort of a stay tuned for more.
Right. Excellent. Well, you know what? We've given you some very good questions, and we're a little bit over time now. So unless I see any more questions coming up, which I don't, Rachel, please stay with me for a minute. I'd like to end our seminar today and thank Rachel Colley very much for her great informative seminar. What a wonderful bit of information you gave us. I'm really enlightened by it. Thank you very much for coming today. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Okay. That's the end of our seminar. Let's stop.